We still have a lot more to come today. We're going to be talking more about tech for good and sustainability. This next panel is one that's, well, it's not a panel, it's a fireside chat. It's just me and one other person. But stay here because it's really important. It's about media and journalism specifically. Raise your hand if you looked at some news today. Yeah, most of us. Where did you turn on the TV or did you look at your TV? Phone? Most of us are on our phones. It's become so challenging now that all of us are getting our news from our phones, from Twitter or, I don't know, Snap, old traditional news sites on the phone, to sometimes know what's real, what's not real. My next guest is here to talk about how her organization is doing real-time verification and also the ethical decisions that go into that. So please give a very warm welcome to the Director of Operations at Bellingcat, Dessi Damianova. So good to have you. Welcome. So, raise your hand if you've heard of Bellingcat. Most people. Okay. If you haven't heard of it, or if you're just waking up this morning, does it give us a little overview? What is Bellingcat? What are you doing? Who owns you?
Bellingcat is an international non-profit organization of open source researchers, citizen journalists, and investigators. And we apply open source methods to events of public interest, and we use open source methodologies to discover findings that can promote public debate. We are not owned by anyone. We are a foundation and a charity based in the Netherlands, and we operate globally.
Okay, very cool. Tell me about your own role at Bellingcat. Director of Operations, what do you do there?
So my role is to make sure that everything we do is smooth and all the operations and activities run well and smoothly. For example, I have established an editorial team, an investigative tech team, make sure that all our finances are extremely robust because, as I said, we are a foundation and a charity, so we have to comply with a lot of public scrutiny. Moreover, one of our main principles is complete transparency. So we have to be transparent in our investigative methodologies, but also in where we get money from, how we spend it, and so on and so forth. So my role is to make sure that everything runs smoothly.
So you have transparency in the methodology and transparency in the funding. Which should we tackle first? Should we talk about methodology or should we talk about funding?
As you wish.
Let's go with the money. Money always talks, right? Where does the money come from? How are you financed? Because doing good journalism costs a lot of money. I was a journalist for a long time. It's expensive.
Yeah, that's true. So as a foundation and as a charity, we operate with donations and funds.
Donations.
And these come from different sources. We have a lot of individual donors and individuals that give us small or larger amounts. We have institutional donors, some very prominent family foundations. We don't accept government funding. We never apply.
No government funding?
No, we never apply for projects and we never accept direct government funding. There are one exception actually. We are sometimes asked to contribute and work together with other partners on projects funded by intergovernmental organizations. That means EU or UN. This is the only exception that we apply to accepting government funding, and this we do in cases where journalists or human rights activists that we train in our methods, for example, cannot afford to come to the training that we organize, and that is why they use sometimes funding from United Nations or the European Union.
Okay, got it. Let's pivot back now to talking about transparency in your methodology. This is a complicated issue for journalists because a lot of times you have some information, and if you tell people where you got it, you put your source at risk. So how are you guys thinking about that, specifically when it comes to open source investigations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we have established almost 2 years ago ethics board within our organization. Transparency is for us really very crucial because this is how we build trust with our audience. Every investigation we do, we are very open and transparent about the methodologies behind any investigation or finding. However, more and more, we also have to consider the ethical aspects. For example, in a conflict situation where we use content shared on social media to do any discoveries, we are also inadvertently exposing the witness of a crime, because it's very easy to determine where the person was standing when filming, for example, evidence of a serious crime. So we are sometimes we are very also open to our audience, saying, look, we have all the original content, but we have to blur, for example, the face of the person or certain features so that we don't expose the witness or the person who has shared this content. However, the original content is available and archived by our researchers and investigators, even according to chain of custody, so that it can be used by justice and accountability mechanisms or anyone who wants to see the original content and determine that we have indeed used that in our investigations. But to protect the source, sometimes we have to blur faces, or we also do that when we do investigations on far-right and conspiracy contents, because we see more and more that far-right groups and conspiracy groups are very smart in how they manipulate media, because if you also share the original source of the content, this is serving as amplification of this conspiracy channel. So we also have to make sure that when we share our methodologies, we do screenshots and blur the original source or the platform where it was published, but it is available with our researchers for anyone to check.
I imagine these are difficult decisions, difficult conversations to be having in a newsroom or in whatever forum you're having them. Who decides? Is there a boss of Bellingcat who's like, we're going to blur that guy's face and we're not going to publish this? How are the, internally, be transparent with us, how are the decisions made?
So we have an ethics board, as I said, which consists of almost half of all our team.
Wow.
Which includes editors, investigators, even people from the administrative staff and representatives of the management. So we decide together how we go about situations where we really need to consider the ethical considerations primary to our wish to be completely transparent. And I would like to highlight one incident of last year. We have done investigations into a case where a Russian soldier was mutilating a Ukrainian prisoner of war. So we there was a discussion whether to show the face, like all other media were showing
the face of the perpetrator.
The face of the perpetrator. We decided against after very hefty discussions, because we were considering the implications for the family of the perpetrator, that they can receive backlash. So we had enough evidence, open source evidence, to determine that this was the person that did the crime. However, we decided that showing the face would not add any additional value to the conclusion.
And the ethics board made that decision.
The ethics board made that decision, even against, I must say, even against a wish from the top management. So our firewall and ethics considerations withstood even pressure from top management.
That's really interesting. I've been part of a lot of newsroom discussions like these, and it's very rare that management doesn't win. So that's pretty unique. I'm wondering how you balance the need for transparency in protecting your sources in the field. How are you thinking about them?
Yeah, this is something which we, as I said, which we consider more and more, especially, as I said, in a conflict situation where, for example, in Ukraine, we are working on setting up a civilian harm map where we collect and authenticate cases of civilian harm. And to determine that, we use content shared or produced by witnesses. So in a situation where control over towns and cities changes sometimes hourly, we have to make sure that we protect the source as much as possible, of course, so that this witness of a crime is not exposed to a government, military, or any other identification for the bad purposes.
I'm curious.
It's very difficult.
It sounds difficult. I don't envy you the task.
And in our case, because we are not bound to speed so we really take our time to determine all kinds of considerations before we publish, because for us, the speed to be the first is not really necessary and important.
Speed is often the enemy of accuracy when it comes to news. And that's, I think, such a good tip if you're looking at something and it's just happened. Like, I mean, every mass shooting, there's always maybe 2 shooters to start, and then it turns out there's only 1. Like, everything that comes out in the heat of the moment needs to be evaluated with like an extra close lens. I want to go back to something you said earlier about, witnessing potential war crimes or just really terrible stuff. How do you view your own ethical obligations to report that to, say, higher bodies or institutes of justice? I know you're operating internationally, it's complicated, but walk me through how Bellingcat thinks about that.
So when we have investigations that the evidence or the findings or the facts of for these investigations, the open source content contains really very graphic details. We preserve the material, but when we publish the investigation, we try to blur the most graphic details so that we can protect the audience against viewing such very highly problematic content. However, as I said, the original open source content is available and also archived according to a methodology which was actually also accepted and approved by the International Criminal Court. We sometimes go to extremes to make sure that we are true to our wish for transparency and explain our methodologies to the full. However, in some cases, we have to make sure that we blur some very exposing details, which are not actually adding a lot new information to the investigation and the conclusion.
Yeah. You've talked about blurring people's faces, and I'm wondering about, all the images that all of us see online. We've been talking the last couple of days about generative AI. It's getting better and better. I was looking at some pictures that an AI made, and honestly, I'm not a Bellingcat researcher, but I didn't know they were fake. They look real to me. How worried are you about that? Because you're looking at pictures from all over the world and trying to say, well, this is what the grass looks like there, and this is what license plates look like in this country, and yes, it's probably accurate. But the AI is getting really good, and it's only getting better. So how worried are you, and what steps are you taking?
We are very worried because even though the technology is new, the human psychology that reacts to these technologies is constant, and it's very, it's very old. So I'm just going to answer your questions by 2 examples to emphasize why we are so worried. A couple of weeks ago, when AI images were shared widely on the internet about a supposed fire on the Pentagon, it was one of our researchers who first determined that this is AI-generated image, even after Bloomberg retweeted this information. So he resisted his urge also to share, which is the problem always in these kind of situations, and we're just looking at all the small details that he could analyze whether this is AI or not. And indeed, he determined on the basis of the facts that this should be and could be only AI generated. The other example, and this has to do with not just the speed and the wish of people to react very quickly to whatever they see without even stopping and thinking hey, is this true or is this not? Also, what plays a role is the source, which distributes or amplifies this information. A couple of months ago, our founder, Elliot Higgins, made AI-generated images from being arrested. So even some German media just republished it without, because they thought, oh, if Bellingcat distributes it, then it must be true.
He's
even
a believable source,
exactly.
yeah.
And we did it precisely to make a point, don't trust the source, always check, always corroborate, also always double check, triple check. Maybe even the source that you think is reliable is not reliable. So this only also shows again how quickly it is to fall for AI generated images.
It's so tricky because, we tell people oh, don't trust the source. But at the same time, we all have jobs. If you can't look at something from, I don't want to name names, but let's say a reputable media organization and accept that it's true, what are people supposed to do? Like, I don't have all day to call the Pentagon and be like, is there really a fire?
Exactly. Well, that is indeed the tricky part, because nowadays everything has to happen so quick. People's attention is really distributed between so many tasks, and there's no time. But sometimes it really pays off if we just stop for a few minutes. It doesn't have to. You don't have to analyze for hours and days, but just to resist the urge to immediately react. This is what we are trying also to teach in our workshops, and also to teach our audience in our investigations. That is why we never try to be the first in publishing. We just take our time as much as possible, so that we can determine really from all kinds of aspects whether something is true or not. It really pays off.
So resist the urge to share immediately. It's so easy to say that, but there's like an entire digital media ecosystem that has incentivized us to share quickly. We're rewarded for it.
Exactly.
Are you optimistic that we're all going to be able to resist that when like the smartest people in the world have spent a lot of time and billions of dollars encouraging us to do that?
We have to be optimistic, because what we see actually with Bellingcat, but also with a lot of other more and more investigative media and also investigative outlets, that they're really trying to pause for a second and take their time to analyze before they publish or before they come to findings. Of course, this is difficult, but we have to be optimistic, because otherwise,
we have to be optimistic because it's too depressing otherwise? Is that yeah, okay, all right, I buy that. So, you were talking about these workshops you do. Tell us a little bit about that, how you see your role there in teaching people about how to evaluate media.
So, outside of investigations and publications, one of our main activities is indeed to develop our own tools and share free with the public that can help open source investigators. And one of our main principles is that we want to share our knowledge. So we do that in different ways. One way is by publishing our investigations for free. And another way, as I said, of developing tools. But also we do a lot of workshops, very often for free. Sometimes they are paid, so that we teach everyone basically who wants to come to our workshops how to use our methods, and how to use it not just in situations which are in conflict situations, but also to apply it to their daily life. So our workshops are really very popular, and we are also trying to develop modules based on our methodologies, for example, for secondary schools, where we try to teach the younger generation, younger people, how to use media, not for media literacy, because literacy is a technical term. We use media wisdom.
Okay.
Because wisdom requires a more time to think before you act. And this is what we try to also teach, as I said, at secondary schools, also universities. We have a lot of partnerships. So this is something which we are very passionate about.
I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time. And one thing I'm always curious about is someone like you who's consuming a lot of information, a lot of news, also working in the industry. Where do you get your news? What's the first site you look at during the day?
Well, I try to use at least 20 sources before
20 sources?
Yes, before I determine whether something. So if I read something on the BBC, for example, I go and check at CNN, I go to check it at Twitter, I go to check the local media. So before I even can think for myself, hey, is this true? Then I want to make sure that there are at least 10 or 15 other sources that can corroborate the same information. For us, it's connecting the dots, because this is also very important. Sometimes, even if a fact is true or authenticated, if it's in isolation, it may mean something completely different, because it's the context which can determine really, because a fact is a combination of sources. It is not just one or two sources.
Okay, so I'm just thinking of how to wrap this up. And what I'm hearing you say is verify, compare your sources, and avoid the need for speed.
Exactly.
You want to add anything else to that list? Any take-homes for our audience?
Well, that's already a lot for a start, so
it is
I would just leave it there.
I don't think I can aspire to hitting 20 sources for every news article, but I will take that to heart and certainly try and find more information and more context. Dessi Damianova of Bellingcat, thank you so much for being here with us today.